Thomas Jefferson, The Paradox of Liberty, April 13, 1743. A plantation called Shadwell in the Virginia wilderness, near the edge of the Blue Ridge Mountains. In a world built on slavery and aristocratic privilege, a child was born who would pen the most revolutionary words in human history. All men are created equal. This is the story of Thomas Jefferson, a story of brilliant contradictions and moral complexity, of soaring ideals and profound hypocrisy, of a man who proclaimed universal liberty while enslaving hundreds of human beings. His life would be marked by intellectual genius and personal tragedy, by political triumph and crushing debt, by public achievement and private scandal. He would write the Declaration of Independence, double the size of the United States, and found a university. Yet he would also betray his own principles, exploit those he claimed to protect, and die bankrupt and broken. This is not just the story of a president. This is the story of a man who embodied America's greatest promise and its deepest shame, who showed that brilliance and moral blindness can exist in the same soul, who proved that even the architects of freedom can be prisoners of their time. This is the story of Thomas Jefferson. Early years. Thomas Jefferson was born on April 13, 1743, at Shadwell Plantation in Goochland County, later Albemarle County, Virginia, to Peter Jefferson and Jane Randolph Jefferson. His father, Peter, was a self-made man, a surveyor, mapmaker, and planter who had built modest wealth through hard work, land acquisition, and advantageous connections. His mother, Jane Randolph, came from one of Virginia's most distinguished families, connecting young Thomas to the colony's aristocratic elite. Thomas was the third of 10 children and the eldest son. He had 2 older sisters, Jane and Mary, and would eventually have 7 younger siblings. The Jefferson family occupied a middle position in Virginia's rigid social hierarchy, respectable and prosperous, but not among the great plantation dynasties that dominated colonial society. Life at Shadwell was comfortable but not luxurious. The plantation sat in the shadow of the Southwest Mountains, in a region that was still frontier territory in the 1740s. Young Thomas grew up surrounded by wilderness, dense forests, rushing streams, and mountains that seemed to touch the sky. This landscape would shape his love of nature and his vision of an agrarian America. Peter Jefferson was a towering figure, literally and figuratively. Standing over 6 feet tall with enormous physical strength, he was known for his surveying expeditions into unmapped wilderness. In 1751, Peter and surveyor Joshua Fry completed the first accurate map of Virginia, a monumental achievement that brought the family recognition and respect. But Peter Jefferson's most important legacy to his son was intellectual curiosity. Though largely self-educated, Peter maintained a library of over 40 books, a significant collection for the Virginia frontier, and he instilled in Thomas a passion for learning that would define his entire life. Thomas's mother, Jane Randolph Jefferson, remains more mysterious. She was well-born and well-connected, but Thomas rarely mentioned her in his extensive writings. Some historians interpret this silence as indifference or even hostility, though the truth is impossible to know with certainty. What is clear is that Thomas's emotional bond was with his father, not his mother. Young Thomas's childhood was marked by privilege, intellectual stimulation, and a secure place in colonial society. He learned to ride horses, hunted in the wilderness, and began his education at age 5 under the tutelage of a local teacher. At 9, he was sent to a boarding school to study Latin, Greek, and French, an education reserved for the sons of gentlemen. Then, in August 1757, disaster struck. Peter Jefferson died suddenly at age 49. The cause of his death is unknown, but his passing was swift and unexpected. Thomas was just 14 years old. When I recollect that at 14 years of age, the whole care and direction of myself was thrown on myself entirely. Without a relation or friend qualified to advise or guide me, Jefferson later wrote. Peter's death left Thomas as the head of the family and the heir to a substantial estate, 2,750 acres of land, dozens of enslaved people, and the responsibilities of managing a plantation. But the estate came with a condition. Thomas would not gain full control until he turned 21. The death of his father was the defining trauma of Jefferson's youth. It forced him into premature adulthood, deprived him of guidance at a critical age, and left him searching for father figures among his teachers and mentors. But it also freed him. With his father gone and his inheritance secured, Thomas could pursue the education his father had valued but never received. He could become the scholar, the thinker, the architect of ideas that Peter Jefferson could only dream of being. At age 16, Thomas entered the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia's colonial capital. It was the second oldest college in America, and it would change his life forever. Education and early career. Thomas Jefferson arrived in Williamsburg in March 1760, a tall, lanky, red-haired teenager from the frontier. Williamsburg was a revelation, a sophisticated town of brick buildings, elegant homes, taverns, theaters, and the magnificent governor's palace. It was a world away from rural Shadwell. At William and Mary, Jefferson fell under the influence of two men who would shape his intellectual development more profoundly than anyone except his father. The first was Dr. William Small, a Scottish professor of mathematics and natural philosophy. Small introduced Jefferson to the Enlightenment, the intellectual movement sweeping Europe that emphasized reason, science, and human progress over tradition and religious authority. Small taught Jefferson to question assumptions, to think critically, and to believe in the power of human reason to improve the world. The second mentor was George Wythe, Virginia's most respected legal scholar. Wythe was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, a brilliant lawyer, and a man of impeccable integrity. After graduating from William and Mary in 1762, Jefferson began studying law under Wythe's direction, a rigorous apprenticeship that lasted 5 years. Wythe's influence on Jefferson was immense. He taught Jefferson not just law, but ethics, classical philosophy, and the principles of republican government. Jefferson later wrote that Wythe was my faithful and beloved mentor in youth, and my most affectionate friend through life. During these formative years, Jefferson also joined an intimate intellectual circle that met regularly at the governor's palace. The group included Dr. Small, George Wythe, and Lieutenant Governor Francis Fauquier, a cultivated gentleman who loved music, science, and philosophy. They discussed literature, politics, science, and the great questions of the Enlightenment over dinner and wine. Jefferson later called these gatherings my great good fortune. Jefferson absorbed everything. He studied 15 hours a day, mastering not just law but also mathematics, architecture, agriculture, music, and languages. He learned to play the violin with considerable skill. He read voraciously in multiple languages: English, French, Latin, Greek, Italian, and Spanish. He kept detailed notebooks filled with observations, quotes, and ideas. But Jefferson was not all books and study. He was also a young man discovering the pleasures and pains of romance. In 1763, Jefferson fell in love with Rebecca Barwell, the 16-year-old sister of a college friend. He was smitten but painfully awkward. His attempts at courtship were disastrous. In one famous incident, he tried to confess his feelings but found himself tongue-tied, managing only to stammer incoherently before fleeing in embarrassment. Rebecca eventually married someone else. The failed romance left Jefferson heartbroken, and convinced that he was unsuited for love. He threw himself even more deeply into his studies, building walls around his emotions that would remain for the rest of his life. In 1767, at age 24, Jefferson was admitted to the Virginia bar. He began practicing law, riding the judicial circuit throughout Virginia to represent clients in county courts. He was a competent lawyer, but not a brilliant one. His real talents lay not in courtroom oratory, but in legal research, writing, and analysis. Jefferson's law practice brought him into contact with the powerful families who dominated Virginia politics. He built a reputation as a learned, principled advocate, though his income from law was modest. His real wealth came from his inheritance, the land and enslaved labor force he had inherited from his father. In 1768, Jefferson began construction on his most ambitious project, Monticello, a grand neoclassical mansion he would design himself on a mountaintop overlooking Shadwell. The name meant Little Mountain in Italian, and the house would become his obsession, a lifelong building project that he would constantly redesign, rebuild, and expand until his death. Monticello was Jefferson's masterpiece, his escape, his private world. It reflected his genius for architecture and design, but also his compulsive need for control and perfection. He would spend the next 40 years, and a fortune he didn't have, building his architectural dream. In 1769, Jefferson was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, the colonial legislature. He was 26 years old and about to enter the world of revolutionary politics that would define his life. Marriage and personal tragedy on New Year's Day, January 1, 1772. 28-year-old Thomas Jefferson married Martha Wales Skelton, a 23-year-old widow with a young son. Martha was beautiful, accomplished, and wealthy. She played the harpsichord and had a lovely singing voice. She and Thomas shared a love of music, he on violin, she on keyboard, and they would spend countless evenings making music together at Monticello. But Martha came with complications. Her first husband, Bathurst Skelton, had died in 1768, leaving her a widow at 20. Her young son, John Skelton, died in 1771 at age 3, just months before her marriage to Jefferson. Martha had already endured profound loss. She also brought wealth to the marriage. When her father, John Wales, died in 1773, Martha inherited 11,000 acres of land and 135 enslaved people, along with crushing debts of 3,749 pounds. Jefferson inherited Martha's share of the estate, including the enslaved people and the debts. It was the beginning of financial troubles that would haunt him forever. Among the enslaved people Jefferson acquired through his marriage was a young woman named Sally Hemings, who was then an infant. Sally was the daughter of Elizabeth Hemings, and likely the daughter of John Wales himself, making her Martha Jefferson's half-sister. This tangled, tragic relationship would later become one of the most controversial aspects of Jefferson's life. Thomas and Martha's marriage was, by all accounts, happy and passionate. They adored each other, but it was also tragically brief and marked by devastating loss. Martha gave birth to 6 children over 10 years. Only 2 would survive to adulthood. Their first child, Martha Washington Jefferson, called Patsy, was born on September 27, 1772. She would survive and become Jefferson's devoted daughter and companion. Their second child, Jane Randolph Jefferson, was born on April 3, 1774, but died on September 5, 1775, at 17 months old. Their third child, a son born on May 28, 1777, died after just 17 days. He was never formally named. Their fourth child, Mary Jefferson, called Polly or Maria, was born on August 1, 1778. She would survive to adulthood but die young. Their fifth child, Lucy Elizabeth Jefferson, was born on November 3, 1780, but died on April 15, 1781, at 4.5 months old. Their sixth child, another daughter also named Lucy Elizabeth, was born on May 8, 1782. Each pregnancy weakened Martha. Each child's death devastated both parents. But it was the final pregnancy that would prove fatal. After giving birth to Lucy Elizabeth in May 1782, Martha never recovered. She suffered from hemorrhaging, fever, and weakness. For 4 months, she lingered between life and death while Jefferson nursed her with desperate devotion. He barely left her bedside. On September 6, 1782, Martha Jefferson died at age 33. She had been married to Thomas for 10 years and 7 months. Jefferson's grief was total and overwhelming. Witnesses reported that he fainted when Martha died and remained unconscious for so long that they feared for his life. When he finally revived, he paced his room for weeks, sleeping little, eating almost nothing, weeping uncontrollably. His daughter Patsy, then 10 years old, later recalled, "For 3 weeks I never left his side. He walked almost incessantly night and day, only lying down occasionally, when nature was completely exhausted." On a pallet that had been brought in during his long fainting fit, Jefferson had promised Martha on her deathbed that he would never remarry. It was a promise he kept. He never married again, and he destroyed all of Martha's letters to him, almost every trace of their relationship, unable to bear the pain of memory. Martha's death left Jefferson with 3 surviving daughters, 10-year-old Patsy, 4-year-old Polly, and the infant Lucy Elizabeth, who would die of whooping cough in 1784 at age 2, adding yet another unbearable loss. The deaths of his wife and 4 of his 6 children left scars that never healed. Jefferson rarely spoke of Martha after her death. He enclosed his grief behind walls of silence and buried himself in work, the only escape he knew. The Declaration of Independence years before Martha's death, Thomas Jefferson had already helped ignite a revolution. In 1774, Jefferson wrote A Summary View of the Rights of British America, a bold pamphlet arguing that the American colonies were not subject to parliamentary authority. The document established Jefferson as one of Virginia's most eloquent voices for colonial rights. In June 1775, after the battles of Lexington and Concord had begun the Revolutionary War, Jefferson was elected to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. He was 32 years old, quiet and reserved in debate but brilliant with the pen. On June 11, 1776, Congress appointed a 5-member committee to draft a Declaration of Independence. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. The committee chose Jefferson to write the first draft. For 17 days in June 1776, Jefferson sat in his rented lodgings on the 2nd floor of a house at the corner of Market and 7th Streets in Philadelphia, and wrote the most important document in American history. He worked on a portable writing desk of his own design, a hinged board with a locking drawer. He dipped his quill pen in ink and began, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. The Declaration of Independence was not entirely original. Jefferson drew from political philosophy he had absorbed, from John Locke, from George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, from Enlightenment thinkers. But Jefferson's genius lay in his language. He transformed abstract philosophy into soaring poetry. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 27 words that changed the world. Jefferson submitted his draft to Congress on June 28. For 3 days, July 24, Congress debated and edited the document. Jefferson sat silently, suffering as his fellow delegates cut and revised his prose. Benjamin Franklin tried to console him. "I have made it a rule, whenever in my power, to avoid becoming the draftsman of papers to be reviewed by a public body." Congress removed about a quarter of Jefferson's text, including a passionate denunciation of the slave trade that Southern delegates refused to accept. The final document was approved on July 4, 1776. Jefferson was 33 years old. He had just written the founding document of American democracy, and he had done so while owning nearly 200 enslaved human beings. The contradiction was not lost on Jefferson's critics, even then. But Jefferson rationalized it in ways that seem incomprehensible today. He genuinely believed slavery was evil and that it degraded both enslaved and enslaver. But he also believed that black people were inherently inferior to whites. He argued that slavery should eventually end, but not in his lifetime, and not in ways that would threaten white property or social order. This moral incoherence would haunt Jefferson's legacy forever. Political rise and the Sally Hemings controversy after the Revolution. Jefferson served as governor of Virginia, 1779–1781, minister to France, 1780–1789, Secretary of State under George Washington, 1790–1793, and Vice President under John Adams, 1797–1801. His career was marked by brilliant achievements and bitter partisan conflicts, but it was during his time in France that one of the most controversial episodes of his life began. In 1787, Jefferson sent for his younger daughter Polly to join him in Paris. 9-year-old Polly made the transatlantic voyage accompanied by a teenage enslaved girl named Sally Hemings, who was then about 14 years old. Sally Hemings was the daughter of Elizabeth Hemings and very likely the daughter of John Wales, making her Martha Jefferson's half-sister. She was described as very handsome with long straight hair down her back. Under French law, Sally was legally free the moment she arrived in France. But she returned to Virginia with Jefferson in 1789, back into slavery. Historical evidence, including DNA testing conducted in 1998, strongly suggests that Jefferson began a sexual relationship with Sally Hemings in Paris, or shortly after their return to Monticello. Sally was approximately 16 when the relationship began. Jefferson was 44. Over the following decades, Sally Hemings bore 6 children. DNA evidence and historical documents indicate that Jefferson almost certainly fathered some, and quite possibly all of Sally's children. The relationship lasted until Jefferson's death in 1826. Was it consensual? The question itself is nearly meaningless. Sally Hemings was Jefferson's legal property. She had no power, no ability to refuse, no protection under law. The relationship, whatever its emotional dimensions, was fundamentally one of exploitation, a master and his enslaved concubine. Jefferson never publicly acknowledged the relationship or the children. He never freed Sally Hemings during his lifetime, though he freed her children. The full truth remained hidden for generations, denied by Jefferson's white descendants, and only fully acknowledged in the late 20th century. The Sally Hemings relationship exposes the rot at the core of Jefferson's philosophy. He proclaimed that all men were created equal while treating human beings as property and sexual objects. He was, in the most profound sense, a man at war with himself, his ideals perpetually betrayed by his actions. The presidency in the bitterly contested election of 1800. Thomas Jefferson defeated incumbent President John Adams in what Jefferson called the Revolution of 1800. He was inaugurated as the 3rd President of the United States on March 4, 1801. At age 57, Jefferson's presidency was marked by both triumph and controversy. His greatest achievement was the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, when Napoleon Bonaparte offered to sell the vast Louisiana territory, 828,000 square miles stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, for $15 million. Jefferson seized the opportunity despite constitutional doubts. The purchase doubled the size of the United States and secured American access to the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. Jefferson immediately commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the new territory, launching one of the greatest expeditions in American history. Jefferson also fought the First Barbary War, 1801–1805, against North African pirates who had been capturing American merchant ships and enslaving their crews. Jefferson refused to pay tribute and sent the U.S. Navy to the Mediterranean, establishing America's willingness to project military power abroad. But Jefferson's presidency also saw serious missteps. His Embargo Act of 1807, designed to punish Britain and France by prohibiting all American exports, devastated the American economy and was deeply unpopular. It was repealed just before Jefferson left office. Jefferson served 2 terms and voluntarily retired in 1809, following Washington's precedent. He was 65 years old and eager to return to Monticello, which he had not seen in 8 years. Final years and crushing debt. Thomas Jefferson's final 17 years were marked by intellectual achievement, crushing debt, and the slow recognition that his life's work was built on a foundation of moral failure. Jefferson devoted his retirement to founding the University of Virginia, which opened in 1825. He designed every building, selected every professor, and planned every detail of the curriculum. It was his final masterpiece, a temple to Enlightenment education, but Jefferson was drowning in debt. He had lived extravagantly his entire life, importing French wines, buying books by the thousands, constantly rebuilding Monticello, entertaining lavishly. He had inherited debts from his father-in-law. The Panic of 1819 had destroyed the value of his lands. By the 1820s, Jefferson owed more than $100,000, well over $2 million in today's dollars. He was forced to sell his magnificent library to Congress. It became the foundation of the Library of Congress to pay some debts, but it wasn't enough. Jefferson knew he would die bankrupt. He knew Monticello would be sold. He knew the enslaved people who had built his world would be auctioned off to pay his creditors. He didn't free them. Except for Sally Hemings' children and a handful of others, Jefferson left his enslaved people in bondage to be sold at auction after his death. In his final months, Jefferson's health deteriorated rapidly. He suffered from chronic diarrhea, kidney problems, and weakness. By June 1826, he was bedridden. July 4, 1826 approached, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson desperately wanted to live to see it. He held on through sheer will. On July 3, Jefferson drifted in and out of consciousness. He asked his doctor, "Is it the 4th?" The doctor replied, "It soon will be." At around 12:50 p.m. on July 4, 1826, 50 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson died at Monticello. He was 83 years old. Incredibly, John Adams died the same day, 5 hours after Jefferson. Adams's last words were reportedly, "Thomas Jefferson still survives." He was wrong by mere hours. The coincidence seemed like divine providence. 2 of the 3 primary authors of American independence dying on the Declaration's 50th anniversary. Jefferson's funeral was simple, attended by family and neighbors. He was buried at Monticello in a grave he had designed. After his death, Jefferson's estate was liquidated. Monticello was sold. Nearly 200 enslaved people were auctioned off, families torn apart to pay Jefferson's debts. His white family was left nearly penniless. Sally Hemings was informally freed by Jefferson's daughter Martha, but was never legally emancipated. She lived in Charlottesville with her sons until her death in 1835. Legacy. Thomas Jefferson's legacy is impossible to summarize simply. He was a man of staggering contradictions, a champion of liberty who owned slaves, a believer in equality who thought black people inferior, a frugal Republican who died in crushing debt from extravagant living. He gave America some of its most enduring ideals. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. These words have inspired liberation movements around the world for over 2 centuries. He doubled the size of the United States through the Louisiana Purchase and opened the West to American expansion. He established the principle of separation of church and state through his Virginia Statute for religious freedom, ensuring that America would not be a theocracy. He founded the University of Virginia and championed public education as essential to democracy. But he also betrayed those ideals at every turn. He enslaved over 600 human beings during his lifetime. He likely engaged in a sexual relationship with an enslaved teenager. He argued that slavery was evil, but did almost nothing to end it, and everything to preserve his own wealth built on enslaved labor. Jefferson once wrote, "I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." He understood the moral horror of slavery, but he lacked the courage to act on that understanding. Jefferson's famous epitaph, which he wrote himself, reads, "Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom, and father of the University of Virginia." He did not mention that he had been President of the United States. He wanted to be remembered for his ideas, not his power, but he also did not mention that he had enslaved hundreds of human beings. That truth he left for history to uncover. Thomas Jefferson's life is America's life, brilliant and idealistic, flawed and hypocritical, soaring and tragic. He gave us the language of freedom while denying freedom to those in his power. He proclaimed equality while enforcing inequality. He dreamed of human progress while chaining human beings. We cannot erase Jefferson from history. His words are too important, his achievements too significant, but we cannot celebrate him without acknowledging the horror of his actions. This is the paradox of Thomas Jefferson. This is why he belongs to the ages, not as a hero, but as a warning of how even the most brilliant minds can rationalize evil. This is the legacy of Thomas Jefferson.